Welcome everyone to this webinar on data privacy, protecting children in the digital age. I'm going to start the PowerPoint presentation, and then once we get that going, we will introduce ourselves as well as the Privacy Foundation and what we are about. Then we'll get straight into our topic. Okay, hopefully you can all see our screen. Okay, so by way of introduction, my name is Annette Mills. I am a professor in information systems at the University of Canterbury. That just simply means I look at technology use in organizations and how it impacts people, society, and so on. And my colleague, I'll let her introduce herself briefly.
Kia ora koutou, ko Rebecca Tokuingawa. Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca. For my day job, I'm a privacy advisor in the health sector, and I'm a member of the Privacy Foundation of New Zealand.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm also a member of the Privacy Foundation of New Zealand. I'm the current convener for the Children's Privacy Working Group. And Rebecca, I took over from Rebecca. So Rebecca was the previous convener, but also very much involved in looking at children's privacy. And this is an area that that is very passionate for both of us. And so therefore we consider it one that is very important to attend to, and we feel very privileged to be able to bring this session to you today. Okay, so we'll launch straight into it. So this is essentially where we're going. We'll tell you a little bit about the Privacy Foundation. Then we'll look at the data privacy and protecting children. We'll look at some of the challenges, and we'll step through a few examples, including things like toys, educational technology, and sharing images of children online. Then I'll hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca will look at children's privacy and the law. We'll also look at recommendations and what we can do. And then we'll conclude and take questions. So let's get straight into it. So the Privacy Foundation of New Zealand, this is also an invitation if you would like to join us. So we're an advocacy group, all volunteers, and we advocate for the protection of the privacy rights of New Zealanders. One of our key things is that we provide independent, informed, and fair public comment on privacy. We have a number of working groups. One of them, of course, is the Children's Privacy Working Group. We also have groups that focus on health, surveillance technologies, and one of our most recently formed groups is on security. We recently made a number of submissions, so many of you might be aware of the current consultation around biometrics. So one of our groups looks at that, and we made a submission on biometrics, and the Children's Privacy Group made a submission to the OPC on its consultation on children's privacy. So some of the things that we'll talk about today are some of the things that we raised in that consultation document, but if you'd like to learn more, please look at our webinar that was posted yesterday. We've also provided a link to the Privacy Foundation, again, if you'd like to find out more about us. So the Children's Working Group. So we've said the Privacy Foundation advocates for privacy rights, and so therefore we are focusing specifically on children and young people. So the privacy rights of tamariki and rangatahi. So we look at privacy-related issues, and there are a number of different areas. We're not limited to these, but that includes looking at issues raised around educational technology, profiling, and commercialization of children's data, which of course then includes matters such as the collection of data, issues around consent, sharenting, a term that may not always be very familiar, but this is where parents or others are sharing images, news items, etc., about children, typically on social media. And one that has risen to prominence is AI and children, having a look at the opportunities, the risks, and even some of the potential harms. So these are some of the things that we are looking at as a foundation. So moving straight into our topic for today, data privacy, protecting children in the digital age. So there is a huge momentum going on right now. If you Google children's privacy, you will come across a number of articles, YouTube videos, etc., that looks at this area, UNESCO reports, and so on. So this includes countries like New Zealand, and I point here to the OPC's current consultation on children, okay, and developments in Australia. So in countries like the UK, the US, there's a lot of privacy reform that is going on that are aimed at advancing the interests of children and creating better and safer places and spaces for children to thrive online. You'll see quite recently, NetSafe has also released some resources around the protection of children online. But there comes a challenge as well. And we're recognizing that our regulatory landscapes require a lot of reform. So Australia is looking at this. And of course, with the OPC's current consultation, it's very clear that New Zealand is also looking at this area as well. Children we feel deserve special protection. Now, all we're showing here is a snapshot of some of the articles that we have picked up globally, as well as some of them within our within our local news media. So, for example, starting off with TikTok, um, very surprising, or I'm not sure, perhaps it's something we expect, but the app was allowing anyone to watch and interact with teenagers in 2020. So can you imagine that for your teenagers who are online? Many of them almost live daily on TikTok, and anyone in the world could interact with them. They were fined 345 million euros for violating children's privacy. Amazon was fined $25 million for violating the privacy of children. I'll come back to that one in a minute because that had to do with a toy that many, many parents were buying for their children. And the question that we have to ask here is what was happening with the data that was being collected? Learning apps in educational technology, remote learning apps are sharing children's data. So not only about collection is one thing, but is sharing it, and then what is that data being used for? And these are things that we want to look at. Um, Parental oversharing of children's data. So that's the sharenting idea. Up in the top corner, you will see an article around a couple that were forced to adopt their own children. The reason I have put this one here is you notice in this picture that the children's faces are not showing. However, we have the full name of the parents. Once we have the full name of the parents, we can identify the children. And so, therefore, even though care is taken not to show their faces, there's information that is available that can help you sometimes to identify, to eventually hone in on their names, perhaps where they live. Perhaps also we know that they're 6 years old. So honing on things like their date of birth. And so sometimes very innocuous things that we don't think about can actually provide a lot of data that can threaten children's privacy. In the lower corner, lots of Android apps, a lot of apps are improperly tracking children's data. And that digital nanny, that very same technology that you put in the hands of your kids to sort of distract them, that can be a tool for other nefarious things. So let's have a look at toys. Children and toys goes back, decades. And I never had a Furby, but perhaps some of you remember, many of us will remember Furby and Tamagotchi. If you didn't feed Tamagotchi, it would die. So these were what we called smart toys. So there's a little bit of, intelligence, so to speak, that's going on, but they were not connected to the internet. So these are the very earliest forms of smart toys. Then technology started to evolve. So meet Kayla. And so Kayla was connected to the internet. Kayla could recognize voices, respond to questions that children would ask, and basically have a conversation. Kayla's conversation, however, was scripted. And so, therefore, what would happen is that there was a database with a number of different responses. So, if the child asked a certain question, the software would look at the database and return a particular response. However, technology is moving on. But let's look back at Kayla. Kayla, My Friend Barbie, and a number of these toys, which were released around this time, actually lasted only about 2 years on the market and got withdrawn. And the reason for that is safety and security. They discovered that Kayla could be hacked. Now, imagine a stranger having a conversation with your child in your own home. So this was the big issue that occurred, which is why these dolls were withdrawn. However, we still have other things that we could raise concerns about. There is information that is shared that the child may share. But remember also, Kayla and other such dolls used voice recognition, so it could pick up conversations that were happening in the environment. And so, therefore, we have a situation where we have ongoing surveillance, data sharing, marketing. There's a bit of marketing being done with kids, for example, talking about the latest Disney movie. So, those subtle ways of marketing products to children. And it was also unclear how the data may be used in the future. What's happened to Kayla? Well, in Germany, they actually issued a kill order for Kayla, and parents were directed to strike the doll with a hammer to basically kill the doll. And the only dolls that now exist in the Spy Museum. New toys. But the Fuzzable toys. This is a fairly new one. Note only $9.67. So very cheap, very fun toy for your kids. And these are relatively new toys connected to Alexa. But experts are warning that these toys could collect and sell your children's data. So if you have a look here, a lot of experts are hoping that this was not the toy that you gave to your kids last Christmas. Now, in New Zealand, I had a look. Many of these toys are not readily available here on the market, but it's only a matter of time before they become available. And of course, they're available on Amazon. And so therefore, it's very easy for us to access these toys. I am not saying that we should not give toys like these to children. I'm saying that it is important to be aware of the data that could be collected and the issues that could arise from it. That actually then leads me to a major issue. This is where Amazon was fined $25 million for violating the privacy of children based around this toy. They were charged with illegally collecting and keeping the voice recordings of the children, and this was one of the toys that came up in that particular case. Meet Moxie. Moxie is just so absolutely cute. So this is a more advanced type of toy. It's what we refer to as an emotion AI toy. So Moxie is able to detect and respond to social signals and emotions. Moxie is targeted at children 5 to 9 years old who need to learn and improve their social development skills, and especially those who are affected by things like autism, anxiety, and depression. So, of course, many parents would want to have a toy like this. If there's a way of being able to help their child, they would invest in these toys. But of course, it raises concerns, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But Moxie uses things like video, voice recognition, and so on to detect and respond to emotions. The next generation of AI toys, brace yourselves, will likely use generative AI to add a more personal touch in place of parents and instill human values such as not telling lies. Let's see what else we've got. Oh, one thing I will add, Moxie's kind of expensive, around 1,500 US dollars, although it was on sale towards the end of last year for about 800 US dollars. But very often, money is perhaps not as big an issue when parents are really trying to find good solutions for their children. Never fair. There's a cheaper toy on the market. This one's only $99. So meet Grok, the robot that can talk, voice-powered chat. By the way, this one is being pushed by Elon Musk. Need I say more? And he's also developing his own version of ChatGPT called Grok AI. Need I say more? This is where this toy is going. Note the ages that it is targeted at, 3 plus. So these toys are these what we could call emo toys are being targeted at children who are younger and younger. What I would also say with this is that it's also making surveillance almost a part of everyday life for the kids. I love this one. Okay, by 2028, you will have AI-enabled teddy bears that could tell your children bedtime stories and basically customize those stories for the particular child. So it could read personalized stories to the children. The toys would know the names, school, friends, and so on. Um, this technology would encourage children to share their secrets, see this as a best friend. And we can ask questions around that. One of my concerns would be, would toys like this begin to replace real relationships? So these are some of the things that we need to ask around that. So very cute, very fuzzy. How about this? Not so cute, not so fuzzy, but it's the same technology. This is a technology that's behind these toys and interacting with your child. Should you allow AI to play with your child? Something to think about. DNA, we all want to know where we come from. Sometimes we also want to find out if we're going to be susceptible to certain challenges. So many parents are uploading their children's DNA, the spit test, spit, send it off an envelope, find out about, whether or not the child is susceptible to certain health issues later on. But it's very important to note, once that is uploaded, then that is forever exposing that child's personal health data, and it cannot be removed. And the issue here is that there's no opt-out for children. I would take it one step further. I think it's not just only about directly uploading children's data, but also when parents actually send their DNA to sites like 23andMe, remember that relatives share the DNA. And so therefore, when we upload ours to find out more about ourselves, we are exposing our children, our grandchildren, and so on. So something to think about before you share. That brings me to sharenting. So this is when parents habitually share news, images, videos, and so on of their children on social media. So on average, studies show that parents post over 1,000 images of their children online before they're old enough to even have their own social media accounts. I'd probably venture to say there's probably a lot more than that. In the US, 92% of 2-year-olds already have an online presence, because many parents think that it's important to actually set up a social media presence for them later on in life. But there are a number of issues that can come up with that. For example, whose identity are we creating? When a parent creates that digital identity, it actually makes it more difficult for the child to establish their own identity as they grow up. And it also impacts the development of their identity. Oversharing of children's information can also violate children's privacy. It exposes children to data brokers, unwanted surveillance, digital kidnapping. There are instances in which people have actually taken the images of children and then pretended that those children are their own. Studies have shown that a significant number of children are actually subject to identity theft. So it's not just something that affects adults. And cyberbullying, that is taking on a whole new league, especially with generative AI and the ability to manipulate images. When images are uploaded um, on children, one can just simply put that image, load it up into Gen AI, and then ask for that image to be manipulated. And there's a lot going on in this space. It's not just about manipulating, for example, how a child looks. It can also be changing their situation or the context in which that photograph was taken, and dare I say it, removing clothing. It's terrible what's going on. So this is a whole new area that our children are going to be facing. So there are a lot of dangers around there. So I'm going to pass over now to Rebecca, and Rebecca is going to talk to us about educational technology, and then move on to looking at some of the legal provisions. Rebecca.
Thanks, Annette. Yes, we thought it would be useful to touch briefly on EdTech or education technologies. A wee while ago now, the Privacy Foundation actually looked at this specifically in a campaign context. We were conscious, particularly around the time of the global pandemic, COVID-19, there had been this exponential rise in EdTech, obviously necessary, and thinking about just from this slide here, some of the opportunities that came from that, obviously improvements in learning. We're thinking about innovation here, definitely recognizing that EdTech can make learning more fun. But of course, with any of the opportunities also comes some potential risks or concerns. And so off the back of the campaign that the Privacy Foundation had, we put together a preliminary issues paper that just set out some of the concerns that really cover the whole information life cycle through collection, use, storage, disclosure. But in particular, we were thinking about things, say, around consent and authorization and how actually meaningful is that and when does that occur in the process of adopting EdTech. Thinking that actually there's not necessarily a lot of choice sometimes as well. It can be quite binary. And thinking also about it from a potentially commercialization perspective, which I'll come on to talk about a little bit, but just asking some of those questions around, well, who has access to this data? How might it be shared beyond the initial provider who's providing the technology? Where else might this data go and how might it be used? Just wait for my slide to click on. There we go. So really, when you look back across a whole number of areas relating to children's privacy, whether it is EdTech, the toys that Annette's just spoken about, games, connected devices, the Internet of Things, it does raise these concerns around surveillance tech for children. And just on this slide here, pulling out a couple of the potential risks or the concerns that can flow here. You know, we're thinking about this around how this actually normalizes surveillance or the sense of always being monitored, that you move from personalization of services to actually hyper-personalization. And then what comes from that is potentially around this restriction of autonomy and freedom in children's development, raises concerns around violation of human rights and so on. Just as we unpack this theme of surveillance and tracking and commercialization a little bit more, one of the things that I always think about is with a particular service or tool that you're using, you know, once the information's been collected for that, you think, okay, there's a primary purpose. It's about delivery of that service, or it's allowing me to use the particular game or whatever it may be. But recognizing that we're in the age of so-called big data and that our phones and devices know a lot about us and that we've got a very large digital footprint. The Washington Post had actually pointed out or reported back in 2020 that it's estimated that 72 million pieces of personal data will be collected on every child around the world before their 13th birthday. So all this information that gets collected might not necessarily be what parents, whānau, and children expect, and it might not be then used in ways that are expected as well. As I say, the Privacy Foundation has raised concerns about potential surveillance and tracking of children through their data, and also this risk that the data may be monetized. Firstly, safety of tamariki is critical, but it's important also to think about children, how children might feel about being able to be seen all the time. And as I say, that sense of being continuously monitored, which could impact autonomy, respect, and dignity. Also, I think about it from the perspective of information that's collected today in 2024. You might feel fine about that and are comfortable with it being used for one particular purpose. But over time, perceptions and feelings about these things can change. And again, thinking about it from a perspective of fairness and respect, information collected about a child, say when they're 14, shouldn't mean that judgments or decisions made at that age should always follow them around in future years. Personal information is collected for commercial purposes and to share with third parties for advertising or other monetization. And some software providers will declare in their privacy notices specifically that they're not using children's data for advertising, but that still can leave some space for other commercial uses and advertising when we've, say, got so-called additional services. There are regulations overseas that we'll come on to talk about. One, say in California, is COPPA. And app and services providers do have privacy terms and conditions. Often these are not always followed. And so there's been reports of app providers using tracking software that isn't meant for children. And you may have seen the headlines about fines and settlements reached overseas, where violations of children's data protection were found against companies like Microsoft for, say, Xbox, and TikTok and YouTube. And Annette touched upon some of those headlines at the start. Again, the Washington Post, in some of its reporting, has highlighted that app developers might try and submit that something that would normally fall within a particular children's privacy regulation overseas doesn't actually apply because they aren't specifically providing a service or an app that's for children. And the example that's up here, reporters gave looking at this paint by numbers game. So it's meant to be for 12-year-olds. The app is free. Looks like it's going to be age appropriate and so on. In the app's privacy policy, actually, it says that the app is for general audiences over the age of 16. So technically, they don't have to ask for age consent. And on the right-hand side of the slide there, just pulled up what the Apple Nutrition label or the privacy indicators talk about may be collected. And then when you actually do a little bit more looking into the privacy statement, we definitely can establish that the app is collecting, obviously, name and phone, the country that you're in through IP address, and also, with consent, if applicable, other location through your IP address, such as city. Information is also obtained from third parties if the service is connected in through Facebook or Google. And so once you bring these into the equation, the amount of information collected can really grow and mushroom. And both children and adults aren't necessarily going to be doing a big deep dive to try and unpack the advice that the app provider also says that, quote, the information we receive depends on the services that you're using, Facebook's terms of service and privacy policy, your privacy settings, and if applicable, your friends' privacy settings. So the risk here is that something very simple, like a colouring in game online, means that your children's data, possibly your own data, depending on your account settings, and then even friends and families' data is firstly collected, and then it might be provided to different third parties, and you don't know who they are, what they might be doing with that information. Definitely understand that businesses need to operate commercially, but it does seem unfair and quite intrusive to have a lot of extra information collected, used, and shared that isn't actually directly necessary for the functioning of the app or the service itself, and used in ways that might not be in the best interests of the child. So moving on to look a little bit about the legal context, and first up, some of the international provisions. So here in New Zealand, we've got the Privacy Act, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But other than that, we don't have anything specifically that relates to or considers tamariki's right to privacy or addresses children's data protection. Overseas, by comparison, there are some laws and codes that apply in different countries. So first up, for example, in the EU, there's GDPR. So this is the big EU privacy law. That has provisions around, firstly, informed consent to collect information, and there's also the right to withdraw that consent. Children are entitled to be informed as to how their data is being used and what rights they have with respect to that data. There needs to be clear notices given, and they need to be addressed to children in plain and age-appropriate language. Children also have the right to be informed of when their personal data is being used for advertising purposes. There's a right of erasure. So this is the right for information to be erased and no longer processed. The GDPR also talks about solely automated decisions and how they shouldn't be made using children's data, and that if this does occur, it needs to be within one of the stated exceptions, and there needs also, importantly, to be sufficient measures in place to protect children's best interests. Under GDPR, companies also need to take care with profiling, which means that any form of automated processing of personal information that is used to evaluate or predict aspects of people, so things like, say, their health, behavior, or movements. This means companies should be thinking carefully about presenting any behavioral advertising to children, so things like ads that are intended to influence behavior or choices. In the US, there's the federal Californian law, COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So that applies to children under 13 and deals with children's data protection in relation to websites and online services. It covers a number of requirements that includes verifiable consent, privacy notices, not making the provision of prizes or services subject to providing more personal information than is necessary, and restrictions on marketing. In the UK, there's the Age Appropriate Design Code, which is also known as the Children's Code. So this is issued by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, like the UK Privacy Commissioner. It's not a law, but it contains 15 standards that online services need to follow. And online services there include games, apps, and connected toys and devices. The code provides that settings must be high privacy by default. Only the minimum amount of personal information should be collected and retained. Children's data should not usually be shared, and geolocation services should be switched off by default. Nudge techniques should not be used to encourage children to provide unnecessary personal data, weaken or turn off their privacy settings. The code also addresses issues of parental control and profiling of children. Closer to home, and Annette pulled some of this together at the start where we were talking about what's happening in Australia. So they're undergoing some privacy law reform at the moment. The Australian government has agreed to include in that law reform that children would be defined as an individual under the age of 18. They would introduce a children's online privacy code, again applying to online services that are likely to be accessed by children. And so the intention there is that the code would align with the UK Children's Code. The Australian government has also agreed in principle to other privacy protecting measures. These should hopefully include a right that there would be the ability to de-index search results containing personal information about a child, provision that direct marketing should be prohibited unless the personal information was collected from the child directly, and that marketing is in the best interests of the child, and that targeting to a child should be prohibited, again, unless it's in the best interests of that child. And so here in Aotearoa, as I said, we've got the Privacy Act 2020. There's 13 information privacy principles under the Act, which guide how organisations collect, store, use, and share information. There are other codes of practice that sit alongside the Act, and they have rules for specific industries, organisations, or types of personal information. So, for example, we've got the Health Information Privacy Code, which is regulating health information. We haven't, however, got any codes specifically relating to, say, education or children's information. The Privacy Act is technology neutral, and with that principles-based approach, then it's designed to be flexible. So in the way that it applies to adults' information, it also applies to children's. We've noted there just a couple of principles in particular that have specific or more particularized focus for children. IPP4 in particular talks about information being collected fairly and the special care that needs to be taken when collecting from children and young people. And we've just pulled up some related provisions there in other legislation, and also noting common law where there's case law, say, around the very famous case of Hawkins and Runting. So, Annette, I'll hand back over to you, or both of us can kind of talk a little bit here around what we can do. Perhaps if I just kick off here, noting with the submission that we made, or the Privacy Foundation made under the Children and Young Persons Privacy Project that the OPC is looking at, and we put forward a number of recommendations. First up, obviously, very much focused on thinking about the need for there to be further strengthening of the law. And there's definitely that opportunity to learn from the international context. You can see the overseas landscape is quite different to what we have here. And although it's really great that there is those overseas provisions, I guess the flip side of that is that things can end up being somewhat a bit of patchwork of legislation or different rules and codes. So I think we're sort of uniquely placed here in New Zealand to design and build and develop provisions that are really suited specifically to New Zealand. We advocated very strongly for there to be the adoption of a rights-based approach when we're thinking about this in terms of privacy protections. We suggested that there could be possibly the appointment specifically of a children's privacy commissioner. And also we think one area of particular focus is definitely strengthening requirements for privacy impact assessments. So thinking just about some general options on what we can do, as I was saying with that EdTech campaign that the Foundation looked at a few years ago, we put together some tips just under that link there, looking at what schools and perhaps parents might like to focus on in terms of digital platforms and communication around online sharing. As I say, very much something that's important to focus on is privacy impact assessments. These don't necessarily have to be big, formal legal exercises. What's important is just making sure that you've turned your mind to some of the key privacy factors or implications. So again, thinking about things in terms of the information life cycle, what information needs to be collected, where information and data goes, who can see it, and how it's stored. And of course, the Privacy Commissioner has the Privacy Impact Assessment Toolkit on their website. I also would be encouraging people to think about what they can do in terms of their own privacy settings. I know it can feel overwhelming on where to start. The Commissioner, with the quote that I've put up here, as recently as April, was noting around something that you can easily manage is having a look at your privacy settings, particularly as it relates to geolocation. Good first step there. There's also resources online that can help. Things like Common Sense Media, they have privacy details for apps based on age and device. NetSafe and Cert New Zealand also have guidance on how to improve your privacy online, and particularly NetSafe in 2020 put out a guide on how to use privacy settings for some of the major social networks. I think also even just the spark of the kōrero is really useful and important. What children and families want in terms of privacy will vary. and becoming aware of potential issues and discussing how you and your child or children feel about them is important. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy has mentioned before that maximising children's privacy is a crucial means of acting in their best interests. A best interest approach requires adults to actively seek children's views and treat them seriously. So just a few tips here that we were thinking about in terms of what parents do. Parents could do. So as I say, checking privacy settings. Familiarize yourself with privacy policies of the sites where you're sharing information. Geolocation, as I say, is one also to be mindful of. Back in that earlier slide where we were looking at that colouring in game, IP address is collected, then location is disclosed. So be careful when sharing your child's location. Some of this comes up also as well when thinking about taking images. So it might be appropriate in some settings that you need to be face on, but other times it might be thinking about how there can be some privacy protections or preserving ways of taking photos, what's happening in your background. And before you post, also just have that little momentary pause thinking about what actually am I sharing here? Am I comfortable with this? Would friends and family be comfortable? Remember, your child has a right to privacy.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So this is actually a good point for me to just mention a couple of just look at a couple questions that were asked before we just conclude this part, because Rebecca was just discussing a number of tips that we had for parents. And one of the questions that we have here is, what are some of the key things to look out for when your child wants to download an app? What's an absolute no-no? We're going to give a couple of tips here, but again, refer to things like NetSafe and so on, and Cert NZ, which provides some very good guidelines around this. But some of the tips that we would give, first of all, make sure that the sites, that the sources that you're downloading the apps from is a trusted source. Pay attention to the reviews in the App Store. Check the app's privacy policy. Look and see what permissions it is asking for. And just because it asks for permission does not mean that you need to say yes to every single permission. Okay. Back to the reviews. Look and see what do other user reviews say. How many people have downloaded it? Does the app have a history of delivering content that would not be suitable for children? And we have seen some of that come up. Apps that are targeted at quite young children, and yet still some of the adverts and some of the things that come up, the innuendos that are presented in the dialogue, appear not to be appropriate, appear not to be age appropriate. So try it out. Have a look at as I said, have a look at the privacy policy settings, understand what these are, have a conversation with your child online about what is happening. I would also really recommend for parents, try out the app first, test it out. It's very tempting to just simply look at what the age recommendation is and then install it, but try it out yourself and see what it is. Be careful about in-app purchases, okay? Teach your child to avoid ads, look out for sharing features, and also have a good conversation with your child about what is appropriate to share online. So those are some of the tips that I would provide there. A second question here, just related to that, was my son often uses Google to sign into other services. Is this something that should be avoided, or he should set up a separate sign-in? Many of these services do actually offer a separate sign-in, but it's just so easy to use our Facebook and to use our Google accounts.
The convenience factor.
Exactly, the convenience factor. But I go back to what Rebecca said earlier. Once you start doing that, then you are linking a number of different things together, and you're increasing that footprint in terms of what data can be collected by particular apps and then how that is used. A lot of apps make their money by being data brokers. They basically collect data and then they pass it on to a data broker. So that app that you think is free and fun, If you're not paying for it, you're paying for it some way, and generally it's with your data. So I would recommend, where possible, to use a separate sign-in. Not as convenient, but it reduces that footprint. So we'll come back to any other questions, but just in closing on this section, um, in terms of looking at protecting children in the digital age, one thing to please remember: children have a right to privacy, and as parents, as adults, as anyone else who looks after children, they have a right to be protected, and so therefore we need to be their protectors. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. I'm going to close the presentation itself now, and then we will look at the questions.
Thanks, Annette. Just while you're doing that, I guess, yeah, it strikes me with that convenience factor around sort of using Google or other third-party services for that single sign-on. Yes, it's easy, but perhaps also as we think about it, we've become a little bit more comfortable, or it's easier when we think about it in an email space now, that you often have, like your sort of primary account, and a lot of people often then set up another secondary account, that all those kind of marketing messages, or when you've signed up for something, that you use that secondary account. So maybe in the sort of way that we're thinking about it, shifting that from the email context to other services or other things that we engage with as well, you just have that secondary account.
Yes. Okay. So I'm just looking through the questions here. So I've answered the first two questions. So Rebecca, do you want to have a look at the third question? This is around the potential loss of the government, with the potential loss of the government chief privacy officer in New Zealand. I'm concerned about personal information of children as held by agencies. Do you agree? Should there be a concern here, especially where the Privacy Act only refers to the manner of collection and no other protections as to children's information? What would you say to that?
Yes, I can understand that people will be concerned about the amount of information or the types of information that's held by different agencies, government agencies, and that particularly relates to children, but also adults as well. There's obviously the right of access for individuals to ask for their own information, and then under the Act as well, it's essentially for children who are under 16, their parents or caregivers, their representatives, sort of steps into their shoes. So you can ask agencies for what information is held about you or your child. I suspect that some of this is going to be looked at with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner's Children and Young Persons project. They'll be thinking about information sharing across different agencies. Obviously, there's some provisions in the legislation, say, around approved information sharing agreements. But I think, yes, it'll be one that may come up through the OPC doing their work. Certainly something to keep an eye on, as you say, with potentially the loss of the government chief privacy officer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And certainly I think also with the campaign that I'll just add to that, the campaign that the OPC is conducting, it's to also raise a number of the issues, not only with government services, but anywhere else, as far as children's information is concerned. And this is actually the second seminar that Rebecca and I are doing. As I mentioned, we did one earlier on Wednesday, and in fact, I did one this morning on Sharenting, if you'd like to have a look. But one of the interesting questions that came up in both sessions was around early childhood centers. So it is clearly an area that is of concern across many areas. And you'll also see in the recent survey that was released by the OPC earlier this week that children's privacy is a concern. So this is an area that is a priority. And so I would say, watch this space. There's a lot of work to be done in here. The next question was about, what would I say to people who think this is a moral panic or overestimation of the danger that AI toys pose? I think like the concern around AI is we don't know enough. Okay, it's very much a black box in many ways. In one sense, AI cannot simply do all the things that people think it does. The movies are not really showing a good picture of what AI can do. The technology is not there. However, there are areas in which we can be concerned. Concerns around, for example, profiling of children, collection of information, and automated decision making. When it comes to AI toys, many of them, and I would speak particularly to those that are targeting emotions, behaviors, the social aspects of the development of a child. The question I would ask is who should play the major role, a toy or the parent? And the direction which some of these toys are going. They are marketed as educational technology, and so therefore they fall outside of certain guidelines. And so therefore, I think it's very important. Perhaps the one recommendation I'd say for any parent is think before you buy. Have a look at the policies and so on, and see whether or not this is an appropriate toy for your child. I don't have a lot of concerns around robotic type toys and toys that teach things like programming. I have a lot more concern around those that are likely to have more of an impact on emotions, social development, behavioral aspects, and so on. So those are the ones that I would raise greater concerns around. Um, Very often, when children spend time online, whether it's with a mobile phone and playing a game or something like that, it is true that the parent is not there all the time. But generally, in many instances, you would choose that game, you would give it to the child, they would have a play with it. Think when they have a teddy bear and that becomes the toy that they sleep with at night and they can interact and it can come up with any sort of conversation that you're not necessarily directly privy to. Is that appropriate? And I think each has to make their own decisions around there. Okay, so there's a question here on appropriate marketing that was mentioned in the UK policy. Now, I'm trying to see is there were some recent guidelines around direct marketing. So I'm not sure if that's what's being referred to here. Um,
It's a good question. It made me think that I don't know any specific examples, say off the top of my head, but one that we can definitely go away or research and have a bit of a look at, and then provide some commentary on.
yes. Okay, is there one place you can go to see who is collecting your data and what they're collecting? The million-dollar question. There are places where you can go and have a look at, for example, all the information that Facebook has on you, that Google has on you. So if you go online, or you can easily contact either Rebecca or myself through the Privacy Foundation, or details are there. My details are available through the University of Canterbury. Um, but there are instructions in terms of how to see this information and to actually download it. And interestingly, it's a task that I set for my students every semester to actually sit down and download all the information that Google has on them or Facebook has on them. They are very surprised at how much there is. Okay, the last question here. Thanks for the presentation. Thank you. I'm curious if the Privacy Foundation's work on children's privacy rights is being guided by the UN's General Comment number 25 on children's rights in relations to the digital environment. Provides some valuable guidance on adopting a rights-based approach, including a section specifically focused on upholding children's right to privacy in digital spaces. Yes, we do refer to a lot of these, and we look at what's happening, guidelines that are produced by the UN, UNESCO, and so on, when we are looking at these areas. We welcome people to join us, certainly because that would help us to address a number of these topics even more. There are just so many areas that we can't possibly cover them all. But thank you very much for that comment.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Do you offer PhD proposals around this subject? You perhaps want to email me and put forward a proposal. We can certainly discuss that. But certainly, yes, I have come across a couple of people who are doing PhDs in this area. So please do reach out and contact me. It's an area that I feel is very important. So certainly happy to have a look at it. Okay. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I think we've managed to answer all of them. So thank you for attending this presentation. The recording will be made available in due course. And if you do have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to us. If you look at the Privacy Foundation of New Zealand website, you will find our contact details there, both Rebecca and myself. You will also, as I said, find my contact details via the University of Canterbury. If you Google Annette Mills, I'm the second one. I'm not the one with the donkey. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Ka kite.